Are hospitals places where people are treated, or places where people are tortured? In fact, both definitions are true, depending on the era in which we look at the hospital. So today we are going to talk about the history of hospitals. And now, let's rewind time and see how hospitals began. In ancient history, hospitals were documented in Greece, Rome, Hindustan, and Persia. In ancient Greece, there were temples dedicated to the healing god Asclepios, and they functioned as centers of medical advice, prognosis, and healing. This is the prototype of our modern hospitals. In these temples, patients were put into a state of induced sleep, which is similar to anesthesia, with the help of opium. During sleep, patients underwent ancient operations and autopsies. In the Asclepios in Epidaurus, 3 large marble plaques dating back to 350 BC preserve the names, medical histories, complaints, and treatment of approximately 70 patients who came to the temple with illnesses. The Romans built buildings called valetudinaria to care for sick slaves, gladiators, and soldiers around 100 BC. The proclamation of Christianity as a universally recognized religion in the Roman Empire led to the expansion of care. By the early 5th century, hospitals had become ubiquitous throughout the Christian East. The buildings, called basilias, resembled a kind of medical town, with housing for doctors and nurses and separate buildings for different classes of patients. There was a separate section for lepers. Some hospitals had libraries and training programs, and doctors collected their medical and pharmacological research in manuscripts. Thus, inpatient medical care in the sense that we think of as a hospital today was an invention driven by Christian charity and Byzantine innovation. In ancient Sri Lanka, King Pandukapaya built hospitals and nursing homes for bedridden patients during the 4th century BC. This provides the earliest literary evidence of hospitals where patients could be accommodated. In the medieval period, the term hospital included hostels for travelers, outpatient clinics for the poor, clinics and surgical rooms for the wounded, and homes for the blind, lame, elderly, and mentally ill. And during the 13th century, a huge number of hospitals were built. The leaders of the movement were Italian cities. Milan had at least a dozen hospitals, and Florence had about 30 hospitals by the end of the 14th century. In Milan, part of the general hospital was designed by Michelangelo. Hospitals began to appear in large numbers in France and England. France began to establish hospitiums or hospices for pilgrims in medieval monasteries. This hospitium eventually evolved into what we now understand as a hospital, where various monks and laypeople provided medical care to sick pilgrims and victims of the numerous plague epidemics and chronic diseases that struck medieval Western Europe. In Persia, the prototype of a modern hospital was the Academy of Gondishapur. In 529, the foundation of the hospital began with scientists studying medical sciences and translating medical texts. Later, the academy included a medical school and hospital, Bimaristan, a pharmacological laboratory, a library, and an observatory. The first Muslim hospital was a leprosy shelter, built in the early 8th century, where patients were kept in isolation but received a stipend to support their families. The first general hospital was built by Harun al-Rashid in 805 AD in Baghdad. By the 10th century, there were 5 more hospitals in Baghdad, while Damascus had 6 hospitals by the 15th century. And Cordoba alone had 50 large hospitals, many of them exclusively for the military. Islamic hospitals were typically large urban structures and were predominantly secular institutions, many of which were open to all, whether male or female, civilian or military, child or adult, rich or poor, Muslim or non-Muslim. The Islamic hospital served several purposes: as a treatment center, a home for patients recovering from illness or accident, a lunatic asylum, and a nursing home with basic needs for the elderly and infirm. A typical hospital was divided into departments of systemic diseases, surgery, and orthopedics, with larger hospitals having more diverse specialties. Each department had a chief, a presiding officer, and a supervisor. Hospitals also had lecture halls and libraries. Hospitals were staffed by sanitary inspectors who regulated cleanliness, accountants, and other administrative personnel. Traditionally, medical facilities were closed every night, but in the 10th century, laws were passed that required hospitals to remain open 24 hours a day. For less serious cases, Doctors operated outpatient clinics. Cities also had first aid centers staffed by doctors for emergencies, often located in crowded public places. The region also had mobile units staffed by doctors and pharmacists to meet the needs of remote communities. It is also known that Baghdad has had a separate hospital for prisoners since the early 10th century, after Vizier Ali ibn Isa ibn Jarrah ibn Sabith wrote to the chief medical officer of Baghdad that prisons should have their own doctors who should examine them daily. The first hospital built in Egypt, in the southwestern quarter of Cairo, was the first documented facility to treat mental illness, while the first Islamic psychiatric hospital was opened in Baghdad in 705. Medieval hospitals in Europe followed a similar pattern to Byzantine hospitals. They were religious communities run by monks and nuns. The Old French term for a hospital was Hôtel Dieu, or Hotel of God. Around 529 AD, Saint Benedict of Nursia founded the first monastery in Europe, Monte Cassino, on a hilltop between Rome and Naples. Saint Benedict wrote the Rule of Saint Benedict, which included a moral obligation to care for the sick. The first Spanish hospital, founded by a Catholic Mason in 580 AD in Mérida, was designed as an inn for travelers, as well as a hospital for citizens and local farmers. The hospital included farms for feeding patients and guests. In 650, the Hôtel Dieu was opened in Paris. Many consider it to be the oldest hospital in the world that is still operating today. It was a multi-purpose institution that served the sick and poor, offering shelter, food, and medical care. In the late 8th and early 9th centuries, Emperor Charlemagne issued a decree to restore decaying hospitals. He also ordered that hospitals be attached to every cathedral and monastery, which is why many modern hospitals are named after churches and saints. In the 10th century, monasteries became key in the medical field. The Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, founded in 910, became a model for other monasteries in France and Germany. Each monastery had a hospital, where not only monks but also other patients were cared for. The Ospedale Maggiore Hospital, also known as Ca' Granda, Great House, in Milan was built in 1456 by order of Francesco Sforza, designed by Antonio Filarete. It became one of the first public hospitals and the largest medical institution of the 15th century, as well as an example of Renaissance architecture in Lombardy. The Order of Hospitallers in 1099 was created to establish hospitals for pilgrims. In Europe, Spanish hospitals became examples of Christian virtue, often attached to monasteries in the form of cross-shaped chapel chambers. By the 11th century, hospitals were established in monasteries all over Europe, and some monasteries even trained their own doctors. The Benedictines founded many hospitals in the 6th to 12th centuries, and in the 12th to 13th centuries, they built a network of independent hospitals to treat common diseases and infections. The hospital movement spread across Europe. In 1287, a 225-bed hospital was built in York, and in 1123, St. Bartholomew's Hospital, founded by Rachel after he recovered from malaria, appeared in London. In the north, during the late Saxon period, monasteries and hospitals served as places of charity for the poor. After the Norman conquest of 1066, hospitals became independent institutions that distributed alms and medicine. The main function of medieval hospitals was worship. The chapel and the priest were integral parts of the hospitals, where prayer was often more important than care. Worship served as a way to alleviate suffering and provide spiritual salvation for the sick. A secondary function was charity for the poor, sick, and travelers. Hospitals provided assistance in the form of long-term care for the infirm, treatment of the sick, and short-term hospitality. However, the level of care varied. Some institutions avoided complex care for fear that it would distract from worship, while others, like St. James and St. Leonard's, served the sick until they recovered or died. The tertiary function is to support education. Initially, hospitals trained chaplains, and from the 13th century they began to teach poor boys, providing them with food and shelter in exchange for help in worship. This was the first part of a video about the history of hospitals. If you liked it, please like and subscribe to the channel. The more likes, the sooner the next part of the video about the history of hospitals will be released. In the next video, we will tell you what hospitals were like from the 16th century to the present day. You will learn why ancient hospitals were better than they are now. So subscribe and don't miss the new video.